Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the second event in the OSS Society's Oh So Social Conversation Series. The inspiration for this name of this month-long series was drawn from the fact that so many OSS personnel were drawn from the social register. It was said its initials really stood for Oh So Social. And for this reason, we're asking you not to practice social distancing. Instead, we'd like everyone gathered tonight to practice Oh So Social distancing. Because we could not hold the Donovan Award dinner this year, we wanted to use this virtual format to keep our OSS family together. We're honored to bring together leading figures from the intelligence and special operations communities to discuss critical national security issues. We're very fortunate tonight to have two of the most distinguished figures in special operations, Dr. Mike Vickers and Admiral Eric Olson, who were confirmed together by the US Senate. They're also recipients of the OSS Society's William J. Donovan Award. In fact, Admiral Olson presented Dr. Vickers with the Donovan Award in 2017. In his award presentation, Admiral Olson created an OSS Society drinking game based on our fondness for repeating the description of an ideal OSS candidate as a PhD who can handle himself in a bar fight. So every time you hear this phrase tonight, you have to take a drink. I'd like to thank our series sponsor, Fiserv, the sponsor of tonight's event, Floor, and our Oh So Social patrons for their generous support. I'd also like to thank our media sponsor, the Cipher Brief. And to the hundreds of people who are with us tonight, including members of the intelligence and special operations communities, the military service academies, representatives from the intelligence and armed service committees, the amazing women in intelligence, and senior government officials, thank you for supporting the OSS Society and for your service. Tonight's discussion is about the current and future state of special operations forces. It picks up where we left off with last week's discussion about a third special operations forces revolution. Before this evening's discussion begins, I'd like to spend a few minutes showing you the OSS Society's most ambitious project, building the National Museum of Intelligence and Special Operations. Eventually, programs such as tonight's will be held in the museum's Oh So Social Club, a bar that will serve as a gathering place for the special operations and intelligence communities, because as a special operator once told me, every operation starts or ends in a bar. And I'd like to show you a brief video about the museum, and we welcome your support in making this vision a reality.
Our history. And I always used to look at the faces and I looked at the eyes. And what dawned on me was there's no difference between those people that were doing that as the greatest generation and the people that are doing it now. There's the same commitment, there's the same belief in country, there's the same love of what this nation stands for. Basically look at somebody and say, you need somebody to go? Send me. I'm your person.
The glorious amateurs from World War II's Office of Strategic Services have become today's quiet professionals of the U.S. intelligence and special operations communities. The National Museum of Intelligence and Special Operations will honor Americans who have served as our nation's first line of defense. It will educate the public about the importance of intelligence and special operations to the preservation of freedom, and inspire future generations to serve. It will be a museum unlike any other, immersing visitors in what it takes to answer our nation's call. We have a unique opportunity to pay tribute to the silent warriors who fight in the shadows for us.
By the very nature of their work, these silent warriors of the intelligence and special operations communities do their job out of public view. Their actions are vital to protecting our national security. The National Museum of Intelligence and Special Operations will tell their story of sacrifice and dedication and bravery. I ask you to join me in supporting this important effort. America needs this museum. The spearhead points the way forward in the past, the present, and the future.
Find out how you can help make this museum a reality and honor those who keep us safe.
I'm honored to introduce noted author and cocktail historian Philip Green. If you've attended the Donovan Award dinner in years past, you'll recognize Phil as the OSS Society's bartender, where he's presented the evening's cocktail from behind our replica of the bar from the Hotel Ritz in Paris that Ernest Hemingway and Colonel David Bruce liberated in 1944. We could not ask for a better red bartender. He's the author of To Have and Have Another, a Hemingway cocktail companion, A Drinkable Feast, a cocktail companion to 1920s Paris, and The Manhattan, the story of the first modern cocktail. When he's not writing books about cocktails, Phil is the trademark counsel for the U.S. Marine Corps. After presenting tonight's drink to Leatherneck at last year's OSS dinner, General Mattis thanked him for glamorizing alcohol. High praise indeed. And the recipe for tonight's cocktail was sent to you with this evening's meeting link. We hope that you will prepare this evening's cocktail along with Phil. And please join me in welcoming Philip Green.
Okay, that's better. Thank you, Charles. Once again, it's been such an honor to be doing the toast for the OSS Society just about every year since 2013. So thank you all for this opportunity. As Charles mentioned, what we're doing this evening, the drink we're doing this evening, we did last year to honor General Mattis, Secretary Mattis, as he received the Donovan Award. And I started off last year by talking about how I've been the trademark counsel for the Marine Corps now 11 years, and it was always an honor to have worked alongside General Mattis during his tenure at the Marine Corps. And it was such an honor last year to be able to meet him and talk with him and give the toast preparatory to his receiving the Donovan Award. And during my toast, I recall the day, probably 7 or 8 years ago, when I was at my office in the Pentagon working, and the phone rings, and it's General Mattis himself. You know, quite a nervous moment. It seems that the issue that he wanted to talk about was people were asking his permission to use his quotations. He's got some colorful quotations on T-shirts, and was this something, as trademark counsel, that I could give him guidance on, that sort of thing. You know, he has so many colorful quotes, such as, "I come in peace, I didn't bring artillery, but I'm pleading with you with tears in my eyes. If you F with me, I'll kill you all." Another one was, "Be polite, be professional, but have a plan to kill everyone you meet." And here's some of my other favorite quotes from General Mattis. "The most important 6 inches on the battlefield is between your ears. I don't lose any sleep at night over the potential for failure. I cannot even spell the word. Marines don't know how to spell the word defeat." Yeah, I guess not knowing how to spell gets you a long way in this town, but I digress. Another appropriate quote, "If you don't fully fund the State Department, then I need to buy more ammunition, ultimately." And of course, I have a soft spot in my heart for this one. "Demonstrate to the world that there is no better friend, no worse enemy than a U.S. Marine." As an aside, I've registered that slogan as a U.S. trademark, so I don't want to see that on any T-shirts without a license. So last year, Charles and I were trying to figure out what drink are we going to do to pay honor to the OSS and Secretary Mattis and the OSS Society. And we talked about different drinks. You've heard me give the story of Ernest Hemingway liberating the Paris Ritz, where he and his band of OSS and French resistance brothers came into the Hotel Ritz and asked the maitre d' for 57 martini cocktails. You've heard that last week. You've heard me tell that one before. So we moved on from that one. We wanted a drink that would really represent General Mattis and the OSS, and we thought maybe the Blood and Sand, or the Hand Grenade, or the Kamikaze, maybe the B-52. Of course, that's the Air Force, different genre, so we threw that out. We considered a centuries-old drink called the Fish House Punch. It was the favorite drink of a legendary Marine Corps general, Victor Krulak. In his biography, the drink is described as, quote, an insidious drink that after 2 glasses causes a peculiar numbness around the ears. After 3 glasses, a man believes he is the smartest person God ever created. Then comes the moment when he thinks bugs are crawling all over his body. So we dismissed the idea of using that one. We also considered a drink called the Guadalcanal cocktail. Now, in August of 1944, Admiral Nimitz in the U.S. Navy dropped off 6,000 Marines onto the tropical island in the Solomons called Guadalcanal, and they promptly skedaddled, leaving the Marines to do their best against the Japanese. And so they were kind enough to leave a bunch of cases of Old Crow whiskey, bourbon whiskey, thinking that, at the end of a hard day fighting the Japanese in the sweltering South Pacific island, you need a little whiskey to take the edge off. So the Marines, the ever resourceful Marines, they liberated some grapefruit juice and some ice from the Japanese ice house, and they made a drink and they called it the Guadalcanal cocktail. But that wasn't the drink we chose last year either. We decided to serve a drink last year that paid appropriate homage to General Mattis, but also have an OSS connection. And the drink we chose was the Leatherneck cocktail, and I'll be making that one for you momentarily. It was actually invented by a Marine major named Frank Farrell. His daughter was in the audience last year, sat at our table. She was delightful. He was the perfect example of what General Donovan called the glorious amateur. He was a Renaissance man. He invented this drink in 1951, and it debuted in his syndicated column in the New York Telegram, and later on appeared in a book called Bottoms Up by Ted Saucier. He was a quintessential Marine and OSS officer, the Renaissance man. He was in 1939 a judge in the Miss America competition. He was recruited into the OSS to infiltrate a Nazi ring in Manhattan, which he subsequently disbanded. In 1942, Farrell and fellow journalist Guy Richards ran an extensive and invaluable network of native islanders in the Solomons to serve as coast watchers and to monitor and report on Japanese activities. Farrell received a Silver Star for his heroic exploits at Peleliu. After the war, Farrell was one of the OSS investigators whose work led to the arrest of 20 Nazis in Shanghai in 1946. I could go on. The guy had an incredible record. He served alongside of Chesty Puller in the Battle of New Britain in New Guinea. Somehow, Farrell also had time to invent the drink you're about to enjoy. I'll ever shut up, of course. The Leatherneck cocktail. From 1948 to 1969, Farrell had a very popular syndicated column in the New York Telegram called New York Day by Day. The Leatherneck cocktail made its debut in Farrell's column on July 17, 1951. The drink is made with 2 ounces of Canadian whiskey, 3/4 ounces of blue curacao. So this will help you get rid of all that blue curacao you probably have at the bottom of your liquor cabinet, and about 1/2 ounce of lime juice. Within the column, Farrell mentions that after he was promoted to major in the Marine Corps, he used the drink to soak his overnight his brand new gold oak leaf cluster insignia to give them some aging. Let's hope the drink is a little easier on our insides than it was on that brass. So let's make the drink. I'm going to start with citrus squeezer. Find them in any grocery store. You can use your bare hands, of course. I'm going to the juice of 1/2 a lime into the shaker. The drink calls for 3/4 ounce of blue curacao. I'm going to dial it back a little bit because the drink is a bit sweet. And I'm making 3 of them. One for my World War II veteran dad, who's right over there, and another for my brother. And 2 ounces of Canadian whiskey. I don't have any Canadian on hand, but I have an excellent rye whiskey called Sazerac Rye. So 2 ounces of that. And you see I have my cocktail glasses chilling. They have ice cubes in them. In his column, Farrell instructed the reader to shake the drink violently on the rocks and serve it in a cocktail glass. He wrote, "Stop smoking, fasten your seatbelts, empty your fountain pens, because after 2 gulps, you'll seriously consider yourself capable of straightening out Chinese fire drills, whatever that means. Kind of sounds like the fish house punch recipe we talked about earlier. Maybe we can add an addendum here. After 3 gulps, you'll be ready to get to break up a bar fight with a PhD, something like that. So let me shake this drink violently. I guess that's violently enough. Now, this is a bit easier than years past when we're serving 500 drinks. 3 is a bit easier. You know, after I gave the toast last year, General Mattis confided to me. He enjoyed it greatly, and he said, "You know, I don't drink anymore, but your toast, I enjoyed it so much, it made me not only want to fall off the wagon, I wanted to jump off the wagon." So, without further ado, here's to the OSS, here's to Secretary Mattis, and to all of our nation's special forces. Let's tip our glass to the tip of the spear. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you, Phil. It's now my honor to welcome Dr. Michael Vickers, who will be our moderator this evening. Dr. Vickers' career as a special operator, CIA operations officer, national security policymaker, and intelligence community leader has spanned the last 2 decades of the Cold War through a decade and a half of our war with Al-Qaeda, its allies and offshoots, service that saw unprecedented senior tenure across Republican and Democratic administrations. More recently, Dr. Vickers served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, exercising authority, direction, and control over the National Security Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, National Reconnaissance Office, Defense Security Service, the intelligence components of the military services, and combatant commands. He's received the nation's highest awards in the fields of intelligence and defense, including the Presidential National Security Medal. He holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins University, an MBA from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, and a BA from the University of Alabama. He's written a memoir that will be published by Knopf Penguin Random House early next year. He currently serves as Executive Vice President at Incatel, a principal with the Telemus Group, a senior advisor to the Boston Consulting Group, a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and on several corporate, nonprofit, and government boards. And Dr. Vickers meets the criteria for what was described as an ideal OSS candidate, a PhD who can handle himself in a bar fight. Excuse me one second. So please welcome Dr. Michael Vickers.
Welcome to the second in our series of Social Conversations. Just to correct the record a bit, my bar fighting days, to the extent they ever existed, were long over by the time I received my PhD. This evening, we will discuss the evolution, current state, and future of U.S. Special Operations Forces with Admiral Eric Olson, the commander of U.S. Special Operations Command from 2007 to 2011. Admiral Olson is a 1973 graduate of the United States Naval Academy and was recently recognized as one of the Academy's distinguished graduates. He was the first Navy SEAL to reach 3- and 4-star rank, and before rising to become SOCOM's deputy commander in 2003 and commander in 2007, he commanded at every level from SEAL platoon to Naval Special Warfare Command. Over the course of his special warfare career, he commanded undersea delivery teams, special boat squadrons, and a special mission unit. He was the first SEAL to have commanded in every area of special warfare. Admiral Olson was twice decorated for heroism in combat, for his actions leading a rescue force in combat in Somalia in October 1993. He was awarded the Silver Star. He is an Arabic and French speaker who received a master's degree in Middle East Studies from the Naval Postgraduate School. In addition to his special warfare assignments, he served as a Navy Foreign Area and Security Assistance Officer in Tunisia and as a UN observer in the Sinai. In 2011, as Charles noted, Admiral Olson received the OSS Society's William J. Donovan Award, whose recipients include a few select former presidents, CIA directors, and secretaries of defense. When I was Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, Low Intensity Conflict, and Interdependent Capabilities, and Admiral Olson was SOCOM Commander, we worked very closely together and traveled frequently to combat zones and other areas of interest. He is a dear friend and the epitome of a special operator and quiet professional. Eric, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Oh So Social Conversation series.
Thanks so much, Mike. Charles, Philip. It's a great pleasure to be with you, Mike, a dear friend and longtime colleague, a guy who offered so much tough love. When I was the SOCOM commander, you were the ASD for SOLIC, which you were for almost all of the 4 years that I was in command, and you were the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence for the rest of that time. So it's a great pleasure to be with you, great pleasure an honor to be with all the friends and colleagues on the net tonight. I did have the opportunity to mix a leatherneck, which looks a lot like the seawater around Peleliu or Guadalcanal or Macon Island. And so I'll raise a toast to you, Mike, and I'll use a toast we used to offer the Russian Navy, which is bottoms up.
There you go. Cheers. Or I should say, na zdravie. Okay, so before we discuss the future of SOF, I want to reflect a bit on your 38 years of active service. So what motivated you to want to attend the Naval Academy? How was your experience there, and why did you choose upon graduation to go into Navy Special Warfare?
Very quickly. I didn't have a military bone in my body. I didn't know anybody who had ever served in the military. Nobody in my family, to include cousins and uncles, had been in the military. But as tough a year as 2020 has been, my junior year in school was pretty tough as well. It was the end of '67 and the beginning of '68. Race riots across the country, the Battle of Khe Sanh and the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, leading to the most vigorous Vietnam protests, the largest protests of the war. The Pueblo and crew were in North Korea. Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy were assassinated. The H3N2 virus was plaguing the world, and I was living in Washington, D.C. for the first semester of that year. I had the opportunity to go visit the largest single Vietnam protest in October of 1967. I came away from there thinking these aren't really my people, but I appreciate the fact that they can do this within eyesight of the nation's capital and the president's house. 3 weeks later, my mother, probably with malice aforethought, drove me up to tour the Naval Academy in Annapolis. And when I asked how much it cost to go there, they said they would actually pay me. I applied to 2 colleges. The other one didn't accept me, and I became sort of the accidental midshipman. I found out soon enough at the Naval Academy that I personally was not so much about the big Navy, about operating big machines, that I was more about the small Navy. And so I looked at the CBs, I looked at the explosive ordnance disposal teams, I looked at the underwater demolition teams, and what was just emerging in the national consciousness at the time, the Navy SEALs. When I had an opportunity to compete for a slot to go directly from Naval Academy to SEAL training, I jumped on and was fortunate to get it.
You know, I always thought that the young men, it was young men in those days, and then young men and women about a decade later, who chose service during those times were really some of our most extraordinary patriots, and I really commend you for that. You know, I joined the Army Special Forces in 1973, and my first unit in 10th Group, I remember we had very limited training ammunition. We did get to go to a lot of military schools, which was one good thing, and had some FTXs, but really benefited from mentors who were a lot of these Lodge Act people who came into the military after fleeing communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet bloc, and then of course Vietnam veterans who served with Mac V. Sog and others. And so for a young pup like me, it was really great training time. You know, that said, the 70s were pretty lean years for our military. And so what was it like to be a Naval Special Warfare officer back then?
Yeah, so you were there in SF. I came out of the Naval Academy in '73, went through SEAL training for the next several months, and because I had already gone to Fort Benning jump school while I was a midshipman at the Naval Academy, I actually deployed on my first operational deployment as a frogman 2 weeks after I came out of SEAL training. And so I have to say I didn't know any different. I didn't know it wasn't a good time for the military. I mean, I guess if my antenna had been, fully up, I would have been more aware. But for me, it was about learning my trade, about learning what it meant to be a leader, and being a leader at that time for a 21, 22-year-old guy, when almost everybody in my platoon was a grizzled Vietnam veteran, was something I had to take seriously. And so I think that sort of my first 5 years were those tactical years, learning my craft and learning officership to the extent that I could, and most of it I learned from the guys in my platoon who helped me along. And then towards the end of the 70s, I had the opportunity to volunteer for an out-of-community tour, and I chose to be a peacekeeper in the Middle East. I was intrigued by that part of the world for no particular reason. I just caught my interest, and so I had the opportunity to go work in Israel and Lebanon and Egypt for a year and a half, which was an extraordinarily professionally rewarding tour, because for the first time in my life, I got to get out of the United States, out of my skin, out of my frogman uniform, and look back at all of that through the eyes of 36 other countries that were participating in that mission. And I was the youngest and the most junior of all the 300 members of that force. And I have to say, it was a personally very rewarding time, because I met my wife in Jerusalem during that tour. She was on mission from New York.
Last week, we talked about the major special operations reforms of the 1980s, the creation of the Joint Special Operations Command, United States Special Operations Command, and the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict. The 1980s for me were really, my last 3 years in special operations were all about counterterrorism and counterterrorism intelligence in particular. And then I went to the Central Intelligence Agency and got to practice some of what I'd learned in special operations on a larger stage against the Soviets in Afghanistan. What were the 1980s like for you?
Yeah, probably not too much different. I was still learning my craft in the 80s. I came back from that United Nations tour, became a SEAL instructor at the training command. I went to Arabic language school because I had volunteered and been selected to be the American liaison to the Saudi Navy Special Operations Program. That assignment was canceled while I was in language school, but I got to go to the full Arabic language school at DLI. I ended up, after my sort of professional, career ticket punches that were required along the way, going back to DLI to go to French language school before going to Tunisia, which was a fascinating time in the Middle East. PLO headquarters was in Tunisia at the time. The mission that assassinated Abu Jihad, who was the number 2 of the PLO, happened sort of down the street from where we lived, and it was an immersion in North African, Middle Eastern politics after only a few years after having been immersed in the sort of Palestinian-Israeli side of it. So that sort of emphasized my zeal, I think, to get deeper into the Middle East and to get my degree at the Naval Postgraduate School in Middle Eastern Studies, which I also did in the 80s. So I have to say the 80s were a time of professional development, and what crept in at the end was this sense of of a very disrupted world, including terrorism, as it became less about, of course, and at the end of the 80s, it became sort of the end of the Cold War era.
Yeah, I remember as a CIA officer in Beirut after the Beirut bombings of our embassy and the Marine barracks and kidnapping of a lot of Americans, including our chief of station, that just how foreign the Middle East, but intriguing it seemed. But I thought The Wizard of Oz and Dorothy, you're not in Kansas anymore, but quite an experience. There were two competing impulses. 1980s were pretty good years for SOF, but there are two competing impulses. One to more fully integrate SOF with conventional forces, a long-term trend after the Vietnam War, and then also separately to establish a distinct SOF enterprise within the Department of Defense. A major theme in naval special warfare in the 1980s and 90s, as I recall, was to put small groups of SEALs on ships for extended deployments. How did you feel about that?
Well, that had been the tradition of the frogmen. And my first three deployments as a frogman were shipboard deployments. We steamed to the target area at 17 knots flank speed, and we arrived with the fleet. And it made sense only in the sense that part of our mission was to clear shallow water of mines for amphibious assaults. And we deployed with the amphibious Navy, and there were Marines deployed as part of the amphibious Navy. And so we were essentially the mine clearing force in very shallow water for the Marine Corps. And that was a primary mission. But that all just began to fade away. And I can't say that there was a sense by the Navy that we needed to be more integrated with them. Although we were very much in a Navy chain of command, even after the creation of SOCOM, only for the first couple of years did the schoolhouse come under U.S. SOCOM's chain of command. The Navy Special Operations, the frogmen and the SEAL teams, were still separated on two different coasts, operating under two distinctly Pacific and Atlantic Fleet chains of command with not much communication between them, let alone amongst the rest of the Special Operations community. And that all sort of sorted itself out. But as it sorted itself out, the funding of MFP-11 began to kick in. The authorities of the SOCOM commander began to kick in. And the Navy started to think of the Navy SEAL community sort of less as sailors in the Navy and more as somebody who, funded and supported by another command, could come back on call and support Navy operations when it was appropriate. It actually was a relatively trauma-free period for the Navy SEAL community, and I give credit to the top Navy SEAL leadership at the time.
So during the 1990s, you received a Bronze Star for Valor for your actions in Operation Desert Storm, and as I mentioned earlier, a Silver Star for your actions in Somalia. You also then rose to Major Command. After your deployment to Somalia, you commanded a Special Mission Unit, and then later, the Naval Special Warfare Command. What sticks out to you the most about your experiences in the 1990s before 9/11?
For me personally, it was the turning point. I can say that of my 38 years of service, I was roughly the first half in the Navy and the second half in Joint SOF. I worked for almost only Navy officers for the first half. I hardly worked for a Navy officer ever in the second half of my career. And this was the establishment of JSOC and SOCOM and all that happened to sort of make that the case. And so for me, the 90s were largely about JSOC and the Special Mission Unit. I commanded up front a Special Boat Squadron, but then went to JSOC and was actually assigned to the JSOC staff in the J3 as during the Somalia operations. Came back and commanded the Special Mission Unit for 3 years, and I went back to JSOC to be the Chief of Staff there for 2 years before making flag and heading up to take command of the Naval Special Warfare Force in Coronado. So this was a hugely important time, I think, for the broader community, and I was just part of that. Very interestingly, I mean, it wasn't a time sort of after Somalia. It wasn't a time an intensively operational period, with the exception of the Haiti operation and the now legendary deployment of JSOC aboard the USS America, which the Navy sort of thought of JSOC as the Antichrist, and all the Navy aircraft were taken off the aircraft carrier, and all special operations aircraft were brought aboard. I had the good fortune, after 3 weeks in command of a special mission unit, of deploying with my entire team aboard USS America for an operational deployment, during which we expected to see at least some level of combat. And so it was, again, just sort of a truly professionally rewarding decade for me.
1990s were also when
Joint SOF, way before JSOC, Joint SOF started to get its legs up.
Yeah. It was also, if I remember right, the period when SOF acquired the counterproliferation of weapons of mass destruction mission, added to its portfolio.
Yeah, a lot of time spent on learning about deep underground targets where we thought the nukes would be, and the equipment and the materials, and so it was a really wonderful period, I would say, of experimentation and getting outside what everybody had sort of come into with as their classic mission training, to really get up and out of that into this whole new global mission area. And this was the transition period into counterterrorism at a grand scale.
Yeah. So while you were in command of WARCOM, what changes did you make to Naval Special Warfare before and then after 9/11, since you straddled that period?
I went out to Naval Special Warfare Command in summer of '99. One of the first things I did was get codified that SEALs wouldn't be riding ships as a routine part of their deployments, that it was better for SEALs to get to the beach before the fleet did. And so we were able to codify that. But I think the main thing was we instituted, what we called NSW, Naval Special Warfare 21, which was it was a reality that operational commanders outside the United States were ordering Navy Special Warfare like items on a menu. They would ask for a SEAL platoon or a communications detachment, maybe a couple of boats, maybe a little bit of EOD, maybe a dog, and it was deploying as a very, very discrete tactical element without any support and without any C2. And so what we determined to do was create Naval Special Warfare squadrons around a SEAL team, augmented to bring in all of these other tools, so that a SEAL team CO with the 05 level became essentially the equivalent of a battalion commander in SF or the Rangers, or a squadron commander in the Air Force, with a much greater degree of wherewithal while deployed with a squadron. And the timing of that was such that this was a ton of work, and every single one of the more than 5,000 manpower billets in Naval Special Warfare had to be rewritten, recoded. I was very fortunate to have Joe McGuire as my deputy, and Joe Kernan as my chief of staff, and they just made it happen. And it happened first around SEAL Team 1 with a guy named Chuck Lockett in command. And the timing was such that we planned for the first squadron deployment of Naval Special Warfare to be ready to go in October of 2001. And of course, then 9/11 came, and we only had to accelerate that a few weeks. But it was just sort of serendipity that we were in our ultimate deployable posture at the time we needed to be. And we were also in a 1 in 4 rotation as we build into that. We went from 3 SEAL teams on each coast of 8 platoons to 4 SEAL teams of 6 platoons. Same number of platoons, but in a rotational deployment of 4, and we held to that throughout the early days of the post 9/11 period, and it just turned out.
Yeah, I really think those were big reforms, and or tactical organizational reforms, and I think you really led the way for the community for what we did after 9/11. Then it became common practice to organize that way.
I got to thank my boss, General Pete Schoonmaker, who, when I first talked to him about it, he said, if you require resources to do it, it'll be hard and it'll take a while. If you can do it within your budget and within your manpower, you don't even need to ask me. That's your authority to do that. And so we did it. And later I went and told him what we'd done. And so his sort of permission to do it, and without micromanaging it, just made it possible to happen sort of pretty quickly within the first half of my command to him.
So after 9/11, you led our Special Operations Forces for 8 years, first as Deputy SOCOM Commander and then as Commander. What major milestones did SOF achieve during these 8 years?
So, I mean, I think it was a pretty important period. When I became the deputy in 2003, it was a few months after we had gone into Iraq, and of course, about a year and a half or so after we had gone into Afghanistan. So we were adjusting to the wartime posture. I think the force did that ultimately pretty well, but we had to grow quickly as we were doing it. And during the 8 years that you mentioned, from 2003 to 2011, and I've said this several times, including to Congress, we doubled our manpower from about 32,000 to 65,000. We tripled our budget from about 3.2 billion to $10 billion a year, and we quadrupled our daily overseas deployments. And we had to do that without taking even a momentary hit in the quality of what it was we were providing. And we had to reorient our global deployments to focus about 85% on CENTCOM. And so this became sort of a time where it was less about the vision and more about meeting the demand. Right. Everybody wanted more of us. And you certainly saw that from ASD. The RFF, the requests for forces, were very heavy on special operations forces, even though there was often not a good view of how to use them. They just knew they wanted them. And in some cases, they were severely misused and abused. At one point, we deployed a Special Forces ODA, which was on arrival in theater, was broken down into 6 two-man guard posts, and not at all what the RFF had indicated they would be used for. And so this was a time of educating the force about the special operations community, where we're clearly out of the shadows and under a spotlight. We had to educate the top leadership, including the President and the Secretary of Defense, about what special operations was about, not only about the deployment, but about the employment of the forces. And we had to maintain relations around the world as we do that. I think that we got some of it right. We got some of it not quite so right. I think that what was confusing about the period was the fact that SOCOM was designated the, quote, synchronizer, unquote, of the global war on terror, but the authority of a synchronizer was never codified. I testified sitting next to you in our confirmation hearing before Congress. They asked me what I would do, and I said I really have 2 questions that I got to get at, and one is, what does it mean to be the synchronizer in global war on terror, and the other one is, what does it mean to monitor the management of SOF personnel? Because we didn't actually have the authority to control our own people. We were beholden to the services on many of that. We had great influence over it, but we didn't have control over it. And so to some extent, this is a period of sorting all of that out. At the same time, JSOC rose in prominence. JSOC, which used to sort of pride itself around its 96-hour bag, became weeks and months, essentially permanently deployed. It got raised to a 3-star level. It picked up an operational hat under CENTCOM. In some ways, SOCOM became a supporting commander to JSOC outside the United States, while JSOC was a joint component of SOCOM inside the United States. Stan McChrystal handled that very well. Bill McRaven after him handled that very well, but it was a time where the command relationships, frankly, were not always clean because of the JSOC, SOC, CENTCOM, SOCOM sort of competition for resources and missions.
Yeah, I agree with all that. There was a lot done in that period to really expand the force to meet the demand and keep the quality up, which was no small challenge, and to, as you say, concentrate in the Middle East and everything else. The one thing that I think we just didn't have the time to prepare for, given the current war, was the advent of great power competition. So a lot of modernization was just replacing worn out equipment that the war was consuming. We did develop some special capabilities we can't talk about here, but turned out to be useful for the Bin Laden raid. But if I have one regret, I know when I was Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, they started focusing a little more on sort of our post-war and our intelligence posture, including SOF. Last week we discussed this idea of major special operations reforms going forward, and one individual argued to raise the Assistant Secretary for SOLIC to an Undersecretary. Another argued that we need to create a military department of special operations and have a chief of special ops that's a member of the Joint Chief. From your experience, what do you think of those ideas?
Yeah, before I go there, I just want to mention one more thing about the 90s, and that was my boss when I was Deputy General Doug Brown, Night Stalker. Yeah. He had command for 4 years. I was his deputy every day in command, and I learned an awful lot from him. But one of his great legacies, and he has many, was the establishment of the Special Operations Care Coalition. This raised the care of our people, our wounded, our severely injured, the caregivers, their families, to a level that SOF had never seen, and in many ways became the gold standard for the Department of Defense. And in fact, DoD tried to hire some of our SOF Care Coalition leadership away from us, so I didn't want to not mention that. In terms of the organization, I'm not in complete sync with some of what I heard last week. I kind of like it the way it is. The reality of SOCOM that it is that it is different, intentionally so, from the military departments and the services and the defense agencies. I resisted and would still resist anything that would make SOCOM more like a service. I don't think it ought to have a seat among the Joint Chiefs. I think that the cover provided by an Undersecretary of Policy for the ASD SOLIC is very, very powerful. I think a USD SOLIC would be competing with the undersecretaries rather than sort of be supported by all of them. I think that there would be an awful lot of time wasted on non-essential matters if SOCOM was a service and had to behave like one. I mean, I think one of the things that was really important to us was that we were able to actually separate ourselves from some of that during the time I was in command. As an example, we used to have to participate in the JROC, the Joint Requirements Operational Council, and go sit and listen to all these programmatic briefings at the DoD level in case SOCOM had any interest in any of them, or any of them had any interest in us. And it was a huge waste of time for senior leadership in our acquisition community and in the command chain. And finally, we got permission to not participate in that, just keep everybody informed of what we were doing. And it cut thousands of hours of work out of the bureaucratic motion of SOCOM. I think that SOCOM would have to grow much bigger as a headquarters. It would have to look more like both a military department and a service. It would probably require a much bigger presence in DC, where now almost everything important that happens at SOCOM happens inside one building. The acquisition executive comes to the commander's morning briefing. The component commanders, the JSOC commander, the J codes, the acquisition are all in the same room often, and I kind of like that as a model. I read through the legislation. I wasn't senior enough to pay attention to it at the time, but I studied it a little bit later. And from reading through sort of the background discussions that led to the Nunn-Cohen Amendment in 1986, the gist I got out of it was the intent was to create a SOCOM that was less like a service and more like maybe NASA or DARPA or the CIA, somebody who could operate with real independence from brain to battlefield within its own authorities and its own budget. And the beauty, of course, of SOF is the people, but the second most beautiful thing is the MFP-11 budget and the authorities that come with it.
Yesterday was the 19th anniversary of the invasion of Afghanistan, one of the real signature conflicts for SOF in its history. From both a SOF and a national perspective, what do you think we've gotten right, and where could we have done things better or done things differently, perhaps?
I think sort of at a national level, what we could have gotten better was an understanding of the operational context of Afghanistan and later of Iraq. We fought in Afghanistan in particular, we fought a very non-traditional, irregular kind of war with the most conventional thinking we could bring to it. And we tried to apply mass to solve a problem that wasn't a problem mass could solve. And I think that we sort of got off a little bit wrong in that. I think that SOF got a bit out of balance towards the kinetic side. I think that we were responsible for crafting Complan 7500, the famous 3-ball chart, which said that the indirect options had primacy, and they were the decisive operations.
Yeah.
The direct action operations were to buy time and space for the indirect actions to have their decisive effect. Yeah. But then the kinetic actions became sort of ruled the day. It was about finding and killing, capturing and killing those who were coming after us. And I get all that, but it did, I think, get us a bit out of balance. It got the resources out of balance, the competition for supporting force, the competition for aircraft, the competition for ISR assets, all of that a little bit out of balance. And I think ultimately we could have done that a bit better.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one of the things you and I both had a hand in that I'm very proud of was really reorienting SOF in Afghanistan, or a big portion of SOF, to working with tribal elements with the Afghan local police, and we got a pretty big bang for the buck being out in the rural areas compared to some of the raids that everybody was doing.
The other thing in Afghanistan, it wasn't our fault. We fought it unsuccessfully for many years, but ultimately were successful in creating a SOF community in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Prior to that, we had 3 distinct and separate tribes.
Right.
SOF, including the NATO SOF. Right. And it was tough for them to coordinate with each other. And then ultimately there was a senior SOF commander who had oversight of the 3 tribes of SOF, and that made a huge difference.
Yep.
And of course,
so let's now turn to the remainder of our time to the future of SOF. And so to provide context for that discussion, let's begin by describing the key features of the strategic environment in which SOF and our broader national security establishment will have to operate. So for several years, you've taught a graduate course at Columbia on the current and future national security environment called The World at Night. What do you see as our principal national security challenges in the decade ahead?
I think the principal national security challenge is appropriately termed competition with China. I think that we're talking about it wrong in many circles, talking about it as a return to great power competition, when I don't see it as a return to anything. It's the next phase of great power competition, which will likely be very, very different than the previous phases of great power competition. It's a whole different kind of a Cold War with China and with Russia. And I personally, and I'll emphasize my opinions tonight are only mine, but I personally struggle to imagine the scenario that would have us at industrial strength fisticuffs with China. I don't think it's in our interest to see a major war, and I don't think it's in their interest to see a major war. But that doesn't mean that there won't be continuous war around the edges. There will be cyberism and economic warfare and competition for dominance in the region. A bunch of countries around China holding that chip in their hand at the roulette table, not knowing whether to bet it on black or red. And if they bet it on China, we lose. And China is doing everything they can to get them to bet on China. I think China has advantages over us in certain elements of AI and machine learning and weapons and capabilities that are associated with that, like self-guided munitions and autonomous vehicles and the like. And they don't have to play by the same rules we have to play. And so I do think that, we list China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran as the major threats, but I put China in all caps.
Yeah, I do too. And I mean, I really agree with your point that, the main aspects of our competition are likely to be economic and technological, and emerging technologies like AI and quantum technologies and biotech, et cetera, that have implications both for the industries of the future and then national security power. And then a campaign for global, or competition for global influence. And then the third soul, of course, is deterrence and, if necessary, conflict, but that seems the least likely of the if you look at who's going to prevail in 30 years, it'll be because of those other two areas, much less likely open conflict.
Which means we can't wait for that
Right.
that time to start
Right.
doing what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. So which soft missions do you think will rise in importance and which might wane, given the changed environment?
So I think, and I'll talk about both missions and people. I think that we're gonna have to create a better cyber community within SOCOM. I think we're gonna have to create a different kind of an intelligence community within SOCOM. I think we're gonna need a whole new level of area expertise, or Lawrences of wherever around the world, so that we have a deeper understanding of operational context, and we don't get sort of caught by surprise by not being able to work with people the way we have over the last couple of decades, a couple of times. I think it will include anthropologists and experts on societies and people and tribes and all of that. I think we'll have to create highly technical support teams for autonomous and some semi-autonomous kinds of capabilities. We need to be self-reliant in many of those aspects, and I think that SOF is already sort of advantaged towards all of that. I think the generally high IQ, the problem-solving nature, and the longevity in units, once people cross that bridge into SOF, will all help with that. I think that sort of the ideal soldier in World War II was sort of a 20-year-old rifleman, but the ideal soldier in future wars is kind of a 35-year-old jack of many trades, and SOF has an advantage in that area.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think intelligence, global engagement, information ops, a lot of non-kinetic stuff will really rise in importance. We'll still have to be able to do the other stuff.
And I mean this for all the right reasons. I just said jack of all trades, but it's a Jill of all trades. I think one of the mistakes we made coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq is that we did not codify properly the roles of women in our community.
Yeah.
Always had female operators. They've always been enormously important. They've been courageous, often heroic. They died in the line of duty, and they've been as far forward as long as many of the men in our community have been. And I don't think it's simply a matter of approving them to go through the SFQ course or through BUDS training. I think it's a matter of optimizing them within a variety of specialties that they will be essentially far better at than male operators would be.
One of the trends, I think, over the past 30 years, really since the passage of the Goldwater-Nichols Act, and then with all this recent combat experience, is our military, including our special operations forces, have gotten far better at the operational and tactical level than we were, say, in the 1970s when we started out. But I think because of the demands to always serve in operational units, I think some of the strategic expertise that we had in our armed forces in the Cold War waned a bit. What are your views on that?
I think absolutely, and I do think that SOF probably has some latitude in reinventing career paths, at least for certain elements of its force, so that some of that tactical time, in certain places you don't want to sacrifice a minute of it, but in certain other areas of our community, other skills become important. It's not so much how many push-ups you can do or how straight you can shoot. It's a number of other skills that you bring to the SOF fight, and we ought to be able to recognize that. And I think that applies in spades in the reserve community, as in the reserve component as well. You know, I made the point to the Army when I was on active duty that they were actually in better position for the war in Afghanistan at the end of World War II than they were in the year 2000, because at the end of World War II and executing the Marshall Plan, they had capabilities within the force to build airfields and bridges and buildings and towers and do these things, to run banking systems, to run ports, to do all these things largely within the reserve component, who were largely sheriffs and judges and cops and experts across a variety of trades, and those faded away to a large degree, and so we now have to contract all of that out. And I think that's made it far more complex when you want to be reliant and you don't have a sanctuary dome that you can put over the contracted force to keep them safe.
You know, a core requirement of SOF, or for SOF, is to be able to operate in denied areas. And while conflict with great powers who the most formidable denied areas, but they export that stuff as well to some regional powers, the conflict may be unlikely, but you still have to prepare for it. So what factors do you think may limit SOF's ability to operate, you know, within the territory of a significant adversary, including a great power adversary in the future?
Yeah, I think geopolitics is one of those things. We've been very, very fortunate in our last few campaigns to have countries next to where we needed to fight that were willing to host us. And if we had not, for example, had a Kuwait for Iraq, Iraq would have been a far more challenging effort. And so I think there's always the geopolitical thing, and some of that's on the foreign side and some of that's on our own side. In some cases, the greatest resistance to SOF operations was within our own government because of a lack of understanding of what SOF actually does and can do. And then I think we'll be technologically challenged in a serious way. I think the ability to conduct the more clandestine kinds of operations will be impacted by technologies that are much better at finding people and things when you don't want them to be found.
Yeah, I mean, identity intelligence has become a big issue because of biometrics, and China now with its so-called surveillance state, you know, with hundreds of millions of cameras and backed up by artificial intelligence and machine learning. It's a tough environment to operate in, but there are ways. So wrapping up, you know, SOF strongly emphasizes working through others. So how important and how are these relationships likely to change with our interagency and international partners in the emerging security environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody listening to this would would say the same thing, that they are enormously important, and we can't operate without them. SOF never sort of owns the terrain and never has the mass, and so it has to operate with other people cleverly to achieve the SOF goals. I tried to codify that as the commander when I added the fifth SOF truth, which was most special operations would require non-SOF assistance. As a reminder to the force that any attempt to do it without interagency partners, international partners, multi-service partners would likely lead to a less desirable outcome. And I think I can keep talking on that, but I won't.
So I think what we'll do now is turn to audience questions. I think we'll have a number of them. And so let me start with the first few that we have, and encourage our audience to send in more. So first question is, what's your opinion of the value of the NATO SOF commander, or the 3-star we have in Europe coordinating NATO SOF for expeditionary operations and readiness in Europe?
Yeah, I think NATO SOF is a great thing, and I credit Admiral Bill McRaven,
Yeah.
The SOF commander. He created a SOF coordination cell as the first sort of foot in the door to create what ultimately became a multinational fighting force deployable as a multinational force into Afghanistan, where it performed admirably, I mean, exceptionally well. And as I saw it, and I'm not current on it, but as I saw it during the years that I was at SOCOM headquarters, NATO SOF actually became a flag around which the rest of NATO could rally. And they could participate in the small wars with SOF when they had no capacity to participate in the small wars with the rest of their force. It didn't make sense for Lithuania to try to send jets or tanks to Afghanistan, but they can send 15 members of their SOF on a rotational basis and partner those with the Latvians and the Estonians and create sort of this this force that was meaningful and good and capable and valuable. And so I think that this bringing together of NATO SOF to at least coordinate and deconflict emergency procedures, operating procedures, to get the language relatively consistent. I mean the military lexicon relatively consistent across the force, so that they could operate under a commander that they all knew, and who generally came out of the NATO SOF command structure. So I'm all for it, a great fan of it, and I hope that as we draw down from Afghanistan in particular, NATO SOF doesn't sort of start to fade away.
Mm-hmm. And then back to our interagency partners. The key one, obviously, is CIA and the intelligence community. How do you think that relation? Usually the relationship gets much closer during times of war, and then gets a little more distant during peacetime. How do you think that will evolve or should evolve?
I think it's an old adage, and I subscribe to it, that the relationship between all of our, between SOF and all of its interagency partners was stronger the further away it was from DC. And ultimately that migrated back to DC. But it began with relatively junior officers from the agencies, including especially the intelligence community, coming together to solve problems in an operational environment. And then 3 or 4 years later, they would find themselves bumping into each other in the halls of Langley or the Pentagon. And I think that it's now institutionalized to a degree way beyond what it was just a decade or two ago. And I think that some of these are more than good working relationships. They're true deep friendships, and there is a respect for each other that has come along with the breaking down of barriers and lexicon and all the rest of it that used to be the sort of the separators. And so I think it'll take a while to fade away, but I think without cause, without conscious effort to keep the force multi-agency, including SOCOM, there's risk of that. And I think it's up to the leadership now, even when they don't have a need to do so, to continue to the relationship.
There's kind of a tactical question or operational question, which is kind of touched on this a bit before, but do you anticipate in the future that Special Operations Forces will operate under a doctrine that combines information warfare with kinetic operations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where SOF is optimized, is in bringing together many disciplines of warfare into a coherent fight, whether it's many services or many agencies or many nations or many sort of kinds of warfare, like information and tactical warfare. I think that SOF is not all that big on doctrine. I think that most of SOF believes that doctrine is important to write. It's much less important to read. Writing it gets you thinking through the problem, but reading it is likely to mislead you in actually solving an actual crisis, because the theoretical crisis is never identical to the one that you're facing. But I do think that as we craft that kind of thinking and exercise that kind of approach to warfare, it will become part of the toolkit of SOF.
So here's a question. If some of the non-kinetic capabilities are going to become more important, particularly military information support operations, what we used to call psychological operations, do we have the right balance across the force between, our special forces, SEALs, and Rangers who emphasize other missions, and then our PSYOPs and civil affairs operators?
I'm not as current as I should be on that, so I'm a little bit in the Wayback Machine, but I know that when I left uniform, we did not have it right. And I'll, because it was thrown under the bus a little bit last week, I'll say that going to the MISO, the Japanese soup term was driven by operational commanders and ambassadors around the world. Psychological operations didn't sell well as a term. It was tough to go to another country or go to an ambassador and say, we're going to come to your country and do psychological operations, because then it would take an hour presentation to do damage control from having used that term. And so already for many years, we were only psychological operations inside the United States. Everything outside the United States was military information support teams, and they deployed under that name around the world. And so we just changed the name of the community to reflect the reality of what we were deploying as operationally. But I think that we haven't created the experts in our community to do messaging right. We've had to contract out too much of that thinking. We've had to hire too many PhDs who can't win bar fights into the force as anthropological kinds of experts. We end up with our psychological operations community largely approving messages that have been crafted for them, and then running the machines that distribute them. And my own sense is we have that a little bit backwards, that we should be in charge of crafting the message. We can contract out the distribution, but we ought to be the experts of the context and the experts of the message within the SOF community.
And then here's a question about specialized skills. We talked earlier about, kind of improvising and being a jack of all trades. Here's a question about do we need soft ISR or human specialists, or should we rely on the services for that?
This is Eric Olson's opinion, but I have always been against SOCOM being officially codified as a member of the IC. I think that much of SOCOM's ability to operate around the world in the way that it does is that it is not a member of the IC. And it's not, soft people when they go somewhere are generally not considered intelligence collectors. That said, I think it's essential, absolutely essential, that certain elements within SOCOM, the experts at the highest level in intelligence collection, largely for force protection, largely for battlefield, for target tiering, for operational planning, and much of what they collect and analyze will, of course, feed national databases. So I think that SOF needs to embrace that and love it as an element of the force, but not be all about it.
And here's a couple of questions on the relationship between the SOCOM commander and the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Ops and Low Intensity Conflict. The first is, are there authorities that you would like the Assistant Secretary or Undersecretary or whoever the civilian oversight is to have that they don't currently have?
I think that that Title 10, Section 164, which established SOCOM, got it pretty right. It's kind of like the Constitution. It's had to be amended a bit, but not much, as it's evolved over the last, since 1986. But I do think that an authority that ought to reside within the ASD or within the SOCOM commander, probably as a partnership between the two of them, is the authority to train and certify its own acquisition professionals. In my view, the speed of war is often the speed of acquisition, the speed of procurement, the speed of logistics, the speed of providing the force what it needs. And SOCOM is beholden, the soft community is beholden in the acquisition community mostly to people who have been trained and certified by their services, who come into the soft community for a joint tour, who take 6 months or something like that to learn what it actually means to be in the soft community, and then go back ultimately to their own services as acquisition professionals, knowing that their careers depend on how they perform there, not necessarily how well they did at SOCOM. And so I think SOCOM has always operated well away from the edges of its acquisition authority. And I think the MFP11 budget and the acquisition authority to include R&D are really pearls of SOCOM that have not yet been fully appreciated or exploited. So that's the primary one I would say. I could probably think of more, and I did talk about sorting out what it means to monitor the management of people. I think SOCOM ought to have more authority. It ought to be able, as one small thing I tried to do and failed, simply nominate officers for joint positions. Only the services can do that. For example, a joint position opens up on the joint staff. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps get asked to nominate somebody. SOCOM doesn't get asked to nominate anybody. So we have to work that behind the scenes. I have to call the service chief. I have to say this guy would be perfect, or this one would be perfect, and then he says no, but I've got my own favorite, and so that kind of authority for the SOCOM commander in the ASD, I think, in terms of certain elements of actually managing the force, not just monitoring the management, to include training and education, are very important. I'll stop there.
So this question is a little more delicate, but I'll ask it anyway. So this person asked, can you, the way I would characterize our relationship when we were both in senior positions was pretty much a Vulcan mind meld, and we would usually talk through things a lot and evolve our positions. The questioner asked in this case, again, I think it's about civilian oversight, is can you give an example of a significant change at SOCOM or any of the components that you made at the direction of the ASD that you wouldn't have done otherwise?
So I think you said it, and this is just my limited experience, almost all of which is with you, in that it never came to the point where you had to direct me to do anything, because we had a continuous dialogue up to that point, and ultimately we agreed or compromised so that no direction was required. You were a powerful representative, an advocate for the special operations community when it was important and when you believed in what we were doing. And as I said up front, you provided the tough love that comes with oversight of both our budget and our operational activities. And I do think that a good relationship between the SOCOM commander and the ASD is really important. You sat on the board of directors of SOCOM. You had a voice in our acquisition and our operational plan. You had a voice in all of that. I was able to take you with me on many overseas trips, and so you saw the battlefield, and often in the same through a different pair of eyes, but from the same general perspective as I did, and I think that all of that contributed. I think it's very, very important for the ASD to be credible, to be non-political. Another risk you would take if you elevated the position, it would likely become more political and less likely to transition across administrations of different parties, as you did as the ASD, almost equal time under President Bush and under President Obama as ASD SOLIC. And I think that it's important to have a confirmed appointee in the position with a sense that he or she is going to be there for a while, and so that there is an investment in each direction. That ultimately, as Bill McRaven used to say, you can't surge trust, and I think that a good relationship and sort of shared experiences leads to a trust factor that I think I certainly feel I was fortunate to have with you.
Yeah, and likewise, same for me. There's a interesting question about, it's not really related to SOF, but touches on it. Are U.S. cyber capabilities on par with our, I'm getting too many questions now, with the other countries, and is this division separate or under SOCOM? I guess is SOCOM similar in that sense? I'll tackle it first, since I oversaw a lot of our cyber capabilities in the Department of Defense and the IC. Cyber is a very asymmetric domain, and so if I were to look at technical capabilities, the U.S. is in a class by itself, honestly, and it reflects our lead in those industries and our unparalleled intelligence community in certain areas. The asymmetry, however, doesn't mean means that how those capabilities are employed by different countries may vary, and therefore the effects may vary for choices made by national security decision makers. So some of our adversaries, for example, emphasize soft targets, or what we would call in the nuclear world counter-value targets, to attack critical infrastructure in some way, where we tend to be really exquisite and counterforce, and it's a much higher, more difficult technical problem, but it's a strategic asymmetry. And then others, will manipulate social media and stuff that we obviously do less of, et cetera. So anyway, what are your thoughts on cyber more broadly?
I'm with you, and I don't think I have anything to add to that. I'd sound less professional than you do, and so I think that it is one of those things that worries me about our relative capability, and I think we can't relax for a minute in our efforts to continue to grow those capabilities. I think we are already, to a certain extent, in a cyber war, even though it's not killing people every day, and we ought to recognize that.
So I think we have time for one more question, so we'll end on a kind of a big note. We discussed earlier that maybe we emphasized too much the direct approach for too long, and kind of counterterrorism was the paradigm for SOF and for portions of the intelligence community in our long war. And then for the conventional forces, it became counterinsurgency for a while in Iraq and Afghanistan. Neither of those approaches, for a variety of reasons, really led to the end state that we hoped for. As we shift to a very, very different world with different tools, what might replace, particularly if SOCOM is, our special operations forces are in the vanguard on this, what might replace counterterrorism is kind of the organizing principle for how we approach competition, if not conflict.
Well, I think there will still be terrorism. It will look different, but it will be discrete attacks on point targets by forces. I think that cyberism in all of its forms will be a major element of that kind of a conflict. I certainly think that SOF will be able to, SOF's importance will be in the countries around China as much as it is in China directly, although there are certain things with China directly. For example, certain things can only be done sort of within line of sight range, and SOF has more capability to do that than other elements of the force. I think that what SOF does, and we probably don't say this often enough, is really dependent on how the big services decide what it is they're going to do. And just a reminder that the definition of a special operation is simply one that nobody else is organized, trained, or equipped to do. And so as the services, I won't say they become more SOF-like, but some of the missions of SOF are migrating on a smaller level into certain elements of the big services. They've taken on certain aspects of civil affairs, certain aspects of psychological operations, certain aspects of training, of FID. And I think sort of what they're doing will help determine what SOF needs to do, so that we are only doing those things that nobody else is organized, training to do.
Yeah, one of the things I've reflected on is, when I was an assistant secretary, I had responsibility for conventional force transformation and strategic forces, as well as special operations forces. And, as you said, we were really consumed within SOF and the buildup and meeting the demand for all these wars that were so SOF intensive. And then secondarily, the conventional ground forces were very heavily engaged, and so their modernization programs took a backseat. I actually had my most success with the services that were least engaged in those wars, the Air Force and the Navy, as they were looking at the next big conflict and shifting the Navy more toward undersea warfare, and then the Air Force to long-range strike and starting a new bomber and space programs and other things. And it's an interesting kind of organizational bureaucratic lesson about what motivates different entities at different times, and how much you can tackle on your plate. Well, Eric, you've been very, very generous with your time, and I hope we didn't get to all the audience questions, but we got to a number of them, and I want to thank our audience for sending so many in. And Charles, we'll turn it over to you then for any concluding remarks.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank Dr. Vickers and Admiral Olson for sharing their wisdom with us tonight. And I'd also like to thank them for their decades of selfless service to our nation. And again, I'd like to thank our series sponsor, Fiserv, and the event sponsor this evening, Floor. And thanks to the virtual nature of our event, I'm pleased to report that there were no bar fights tonight. In fact, when I spoke to Admiral Olson earlier today, and I reminded him about his PhD who could handle himself in a bar fight drinking game, he said, well, his PhD was honorary, but honorary or not, there's no doubt that Admiral Olson is certainly a PhD who can handle himself in a bar fight.
Indeed.
I want to thank you for joining us this evening. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. We look forward to seeing you next week. We have a great lineup planned. Dr. Vickers will speak with Congressman Mike Waltz about national security challenges for the next administration, and with Assistant Secretary Ellen McCarthy about the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, the successor to the OSS's Research and Analysis Branch, which is celebrating its 75th anniversary this year. And now I'd like to close this evening by showing you a 12-minute documentary that was produced by the OSS Society for last year's William J. Donovan Award dinner honoring General Mattis. The film tells the story of the Marines who served heroically in OSS, including Colonel Frank Farrell, the creator of tonight's drink. So thank you for joining us. I hope to see you next week, and I hope you enjoy this film. Thank you very much.
Great leadership of this great society, Charles.
Thank you, Admiral Olson. Thank you, Mike.
Good night, everybody.